January 17, 1943, Wilhelmshaven, northern Germany. The winter air hangs thick with fuel vapors, and frost as Major Heinz Knoke fastens the leather straps of his flight harness inside the cramped cockpit of his Focke-Wulf FW-190. The metal frame creaks with cold. Around him, the sounds of war blend into a familiar symphony, mechanics shouting over engine roar, boots crunching across frozen tarmac, the metallic clatter of ammunition belts being fed into wing-mounted cannons. He has flown 63 combat missions. He knows the weight of the stick, the smell of cordite, the way gravity pulls at your gut when you roll inverted at 400 kilometers per hour. But today, intelligence officers briefed them on something peculiar, something that made even the most decorated pilots exchange uncertain glances. The Americans, they said, were mounting cameras on their bombers, not for reconnaissance, not for targeting, but to film the combat itself, to record every burst of cannon fire, every diving attack, every kill and every loss as if the sky were a stage and death a performance to be documented. Knoke pulls his goggles down and signals for engine start. The BMW radio coughs, sputters, then explodes into a roar that drowns out thought itself. As his fighter climbs toward the bomber stream forming over the North Sea, he cannot shake the image from his mind. A camera lens staring back at him through the chaos, cold and unblinking, recording his approach for some purpose he cannot yet fathom. In the Luftwaffe, they fight for survival, for the fatherland, for the thin margin between life and the long fall into the sea. But the Americans, it seems, fight for something else entirely. They fight as if the whole world is watching, because it is. The war in the air over Europe had, by the winter of 1943, become a brutal mathematics of attrition. Germany's fighter pilots, the vaunted expert who had carved their names into the annals of aerial warfare during the early years of the conflict, faced a new and terrifying reality. The 8th Air Force, stationed across England's green fields and grey airstrips, had begun mounting daylight bombing raids deep into the Reich. Hundreds of four-engine bombers, flying fortresses and liberators, crossed the channel in formations so vast they darkened the sky, their contrails writing lines of invasion across the stratosphere. Each bomber bristled with machine guns. Each carried tons of high explosive. And now, as German intelligence confirmed with growing unease, each carried something else: cameras. The concept seemed absurd at first. In the Luftwaffe, resources were scarce. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition was precious. Every kilogram of weight in a fighter aircraft meant sacrificed performance, slower climb rate, reduced range, fewer seconds of firing time. The idea of mounting non-essential equipment, especially something as frivolous as a filming device, bordered on madness. German gun cameras existed, yes, but they were lightweight, simple mechanisms designed to confirm kills for the bureaucrats who tallied victories. A few seconds of grainy footage, enough to prove a claim, nothing more. The film was often unusable, the cameras frequently malfunctioned, and no one watched the footage except the pilot himself and perhaps a skeptical adjutant reviewing his score. But the Americans approached the problem differently. They mounted heavy motion picture cameras in the noses of bombers, in tail turrets, in waist gun positions. They filmed in color when possible. They assigned combat cameramen, trained specialists whose sole duty was to document the air war with the same meticulous care a Hollywood director might bring to a feature film. They recorded not just the moment of impact but the entire mission. The takeoff in pre-dawn darkness, the assembly over England as hundreds of aircraft found their formations, the coast of France appearing like a smudge on the horizon, the flak rising in black clouds, and then the fighters. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving from the sun, their wings sparkling with cannon fire, closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. All of it captured on celluloid, frame by frame, second by second. To the German aces, this was incomprehensible. It suggested an industrial capacity so vast, a confidence so absolute, that the Americans could afford to treat war as spectacle. They were not merely fighting to win. They were filming to remember, to teach, to warn, and perhaps most unsettling of all, to prove. Heinz Knoke was not alone in his bewilderment. Across the scattered airfields of Luftwaffe, the Fighter Defense Command protecting Germany's heartland, veterans whispered about the American cameras. Egon Mayer, the brilliant tactician who had pioneered head-on attacks against bomber formations, mentioned it in his after-action reports. Johann Steinhoff, who would survive the war with 176 victories, spoke of it with his wingmen between missions. Even Adolf Galland, the cigar-chomping General der Jagdflieger himself, remarked on the phenomenon with a mixture of professional curiosity and ideological disdain. The Americans, he noted, were turning combat into cinema. They were not warriors in the old sense, knights of the air engaging in individual duels of skill and courage. They were industrialists of violence, mass-producing death with the same systematic efficiency they applied to manufacturing automobiles and refrigerators. And now they were documenting it all, as if the war were not an existential struggle but a grand experiment to be recorded for posterity. What the Germans did not fully understand, could not fully grasp from their perspective of a nation bleeding resources and men, was that the cameras were not an extravagance. They were a weapon, perhaps not in the immediate tactical sense, but in the broader strategic calculus that defined America's approach to total war. The footage served multiple purposes, each more calculated than the last. Gun camera film verified kills and informed tactics, yes, but the broader documentation effort fed a vast analytical machine. Every mission filmed was a mission studied. Intelligence officers pored over the footage frame by frame, noting Luftwaffe formations, identifying squadron markings, analyzing attack patterns. They measured deflection angles and closure rates. They observed which evasive maneuvers worked and which failed. The film became data, and data became doctrine. But beyond the tactical, there was something deeper at work, something that cut to the heart of why America fought wars the way it did. The cameras were instruments of transparency and accountability, concepts alien to the authoritarian regimes of Germany and Japan. American commanders knew the footage would be seen not just by intelligence analysts, but by the public. Edited versions would play in movie theaters across the United States, spliced into newsreels between advertisements for war bonds and victory gardens. The American people would see their sons and brothers fighting at 30,000 feet, see the flak bursting around them, see the enemy fighters streaking past in blurs of gray and black. They would see the cost, yes, but also the courage, the determination, the overwhelming, undeniable might of American industry and will. For German pilots, the revelation came in fragments, pieced together from interrogations of captured American aircrews and from intelligence briefings that grew increasingly surreal as the war progressed. A downed B-17 bombardier might mention, almost casually, that his aircraft carried a cameraman in the nose, filming through plexiglass with a handheld IMO. A flight engineer pulled from the wreckage of a Liberator might describe the electrically operated cameras mounted in the tail turret, designed to capture rear attacks with clarity sufficient for training purposes. Slowly, reluctantly, the German aces began to understand that they were not merely fighting an air force. They were fighting a narrative machine, a system designed to document and disseminate its own power. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. German fighter pilots of 1943 were, by and large, veterans. They had survived the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, the defense of the Reich. They had seen friends burn and fall. They had learned to compartmentalize fear, to function in the thin, freezing air where hesitation meant death. But the cameras introduced a new dimension of unease. To know that your attack was being filmed, that your tactics were being studied, that your image might appear on a screen thousands of miles away in some American cinema. It was disorienting. It made the sky feel less like a battlefield and more like an arena, a coliseum where the Americans played the role of both gladiator and spectator, recording their own triumphs for an audience that spanned continents. Some pilots tried to ignore it. They focused on the fundamentals: altitude, speed, angle of attack. They flew their missions with the same grim professionalism that had sustained them through years of war. But others found themselves haunted by the thought. In the seconds before an attack run, as they positioned their fighters for the diving pass that would send them hurtling through the bomber formation, they wondered, is someone filming this? Will my face appear in some propaganda reel, freeze-framed at the moment of my death? The camera became a ghost in the cockpit, an invisible observer that turned combat into performance and stripped away the intimate, almost private nature of aerial duels. There was also, among the more thoughtful pilots, a grudging admiration. The Americans had industrialized warfare to a degree Germany could never match, and the cameras were merely one small manifestation of that overwhelming material superiority. Where the Luftwaffe struggled to produce enough fighters, enough fuel, enough pilots, the Americans could afford to add weight and complexity for non-essential purposes. They could afford to film because they had already won the economic war. The cameras were not a tactical necessity. They were a luxury, a statement of confidence. We are so strong, they seemed to say, that we can document our victories even as we achieve them. The archives of American combat footage from World War II contain thousands of hours of film, much of it shot in the skies over Europe. Watched today, 70 years removed from the events they capture, the footage retains a visceral power. The quality varies. Some reels are sharp and clear, others grainy and overexposed, but the content is universally haunting. You see formations of bombers stretching to the horizon, their wings glinting in the sun. You see flak bursts blossoming like dark flowers against the pale sky. And then, suddenly, fighters. They appear as tiny specks that grow with terrifying speed into recognizable shapes: the long nose and radial engine of a Focke-Wulf, the sleek profile of a Messerschmitt 109. They close to point-blank range, their guns flickering and then peel away in wild spirals. Sometimes you see bombers fall, wings shearing off, fuselages breaking apart, tiny figures tumbling through space. Other times you see the fighters hit, trailing smoke or flame, spinning down toward the patchwork fields of France or Germany below. What the cameras captured, intentionally or otherwise, was the sheer chaos of modern air combat. There was no romance here, no chivalry. Just speed and violence and the thin margin between survival and oblivion. German pilots who saw this footage after the war, during interrogations or in captured archives, often reacted with a mixture of emotions. Some felt vindicated, seeing their attacks recorded with a clarity that confirmed their skill and courage. Others felt something closer to despair, confronted with visual evidence of the industrial juggernaut they had fought against. One former Luftwaffe pilot, interviewed decades later, described watching American combat footage as seeing ghosts. The faces of men long dead flickered across the screen, their youth and determination frozen in time, a testament to battles that had faded from memory but lived on in celluloid. For the Americans, the footage served its purpose brilliantly. Training films compiled from combat camera reels taught new pilots what to expect, how to react, how to survive. Gunnery school instructors used the footage to demonstrate deflection shooting and target identification. Intelligence analysts measured attack patterns and updated tactical manuals accordingly. And crucially, the footage shaped public perception. Americans saw the air war not as abstract statistics, bombers lost, targets destroyed, but as lived reality. They saw the flak, the fighters, the men who faced them. It made the war real in a way that newspaper headlines never could, and it sustained public support through the long, grinding months of 1943 and 1944, when casualties mounted and victory remained uncertain. There was a particular incident, recorded in the mission reports of the 91st Bomb Group and corroborated by German accounts, that illustrates the strange intersection of combat and cinema. On October 10, 1943, during a raid against the rail yards at Münster, a formation of B-17s found itself under sustained attack by fighters from WWII. Among the German pilots was Lieutenant Hans Ehlers, a 24-year-old veteran with 18 confirmed victories. He approached a trailing fortress from the rear quarter, positioning himself carefully to avoid the tail gunner's field of fire. As he closed to 300 meters, he could see the details of the bomber clearly: the scuffed olive paint, the national insignia, the individual panels of the fuselage. And there, clearly visible in the plexiglass nose, a figure holding a camera filming directly toward him. For a fraction of a second, Ehlers hesitated. Later, he could not articulate why. The tactical situation was ideal. His target was damaged, falling behind the formation, vulnerable. But the sight of that camera, that deliberate act of recording in the midst of chaos, unsettled him. It was as if the bomber crew had accepted their fate and chosen to document it rather than fight it. He fired anyway, training and instinct overrode thought, and watched his rounds walk across the bomber's wing route. The B-17 shuddered, rolled onto its back, and fell away trailing smoke. 6 of the 10-man crew managed to bail out. The cameraman was not among them. Ehlers survived the war and later became a commercial pilot. In interviews conducted in the 1970s, he spoke about that mission and others like it. He described the surreal feeling of being filmed during combat, of knowing that his image existed somewhere in an archive, proof of his actions preserved beyond memory. "We fought to survive," he said. "They fought to win. But they also fought to remember. That was the difference." By early 1944, the strategic air campaign over Europe had reached a crescendo. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, Mustangs and Thunderbolts capable of accompanying the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, shifted the balance decisively in favor of the Allies. German fighter losses mounted catastrophically. Experienced pilots, the expert who had dominated the skies in earlier years, were killed or wounded at rates that could not be replaced. Replacements arrived with minimal training, barely enough hours to take off and land safely, let alone survive combat against veteran American pilots who now held every advantage. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was bleeding to death. And still, the cameras recorded. If anything, the documentation intensified as Allied dominance grew. Camera-equipped fighters joined the bombers, filming the destruction of German industry from low altitude. Reconnaissance aircraft fitted with motion picture cameras captured the aftermath of raids, the cities reduced to rubble, the rail yards twisted into abstract sculptures of steel. The footage accumulated in vast archives, hundreds of thousands of feet of film cataloged and stored, a visual record of industrial warfare waged at a scale previously unimaginable. For German pilots flying their last missions in the spring of 1945, often in jets that lacked fuel for more than a single sortie, the cameras must have seemed like the final indignity. They were being filmed in defeat, their desperation documented for posterity. The American cameramen, riding in the formations that now roamed German skies with impunity, captured the death throes of the Luftwaffe with the same meticulous care they had brought to earlier battles. Messerschmitts burning on their airfields, Focke-Wulfs abandoned beside cratered runways, the occasional jet, and Me-262 or R-234, streaking past at speeds no piston-engine fighter could match, but too few and too late to matter. All of it filmed, catalogued, preserved. There is a philosophical dimension to this obsession with documentation that speaks to fundamental differences between the societies at war. The Third Reich, for all its propagandistic bombast, was built on secrecy and obfuscation. The true costs of war, the casualties, the defeats, the atrocities, were hidden from the German people as long as possible. Goebbels' propaganda ministry manufactured reality, presenting a narrative of inevitable. America, by contrast, operated on principles of transparency, at least relative to its authoritarian enemies. The press had access to the war, constrained by censorship certainly, but present. Photographers and cameramen accompanied combat units. The public was informed, updated, shown the progress of the war in theaters and newspapers. This was not mere altruism, it was strategic. An informed public was an engaged public, more willing to endure rationing and sacrifice if they understood the stakes and saw evidence of progress. The cameras, then, were tools of democratic warfare, mechanisms by which the state maintained the consent of the governed even in the midst of total mobilization. German pilots, products of a very different system, could not have understood this. They saw the cameras as evidence of waste, of arrogance, of a society so divorced from the realities of existential struggle that it could treat war as entertainment. They were not entirely wrong, but they missed the deeper logic. The cameras were not frivolous. They were essential components of America's way of war, which integrated industrial might, technological innovation, and democratic accountability into a system far more resilient than anything the Axis could field. In the final accounting, the cameras achieved something perhaps more lasting than any tactical advantage they conferred. They created a visual archive of unprecedented scope and detail, a record of air combat that historians and researchers continue to study decades later. The footage shows us with brutal clarity what that war looked like from the cockpits and gun turrets of the men who fought it. It preserves their youth, their fear, their professionalism. It documents the machines they flew, the tactics they employed, the skies they fought in. And it serves as a reminder, stark and undeniable, of the costs of the conflict. For the German aces who encountered those cameras in combat, who flew mission after mission knowing they were being documented, the psychological burden was just one more weight added to the many they already carried. They fought against overwhelming odds, against an enemy that could replace every loss, that could afford to film its victories because victory itself was never in doubt. The cameras became symbols of that disparity, visual representations of the gulf between Germany's dwindling resources and America's seemingly infinite capacity to produce, to deploy, to document. Some pilots, in the quiet moments between missions, must have wondered what would happen to that footage. Would it survive the war? Would future generations watch it, see their faces frozen in the seconds before an attack, judge their actions through the lens of history? In a sense, the cameras rendered them immortal, not as heroes or villains, but as participants in a vast tragedy, whose scale and brutality could only be comprehended through the accumulated weight of thousands of hours of film. They could not have known that 70 years later, researchers would sit in climate-controlled archives, watching grainy footage of Focke-Wulfs diving through bomber formations, analyzing their tactics, measuring their deflection angles, preserving their memory in ways no monument or written history could achieve. The symbolic weight of those cameras extends beyond the practical or the tactical. They represent, in miniature, the fundamental nature of the conflict itself. World War II was, among many things, a war of systems, industrial, political, ideological. Germany and Japan fielded highly trained, often superbly skilled warriors, men who had honed their crafts through years of combat and who fought with desperate courage born of existential necessity. But they fought within systems that were brittle, that could not sustain losses, that could not adapt to the grinding realities of industrial total war. America, by contrast, fielded a system designed for that exact challenge. It could absorb losses and replace them. It could outproduce any rival. It could innovate, document, learn, and apply those lessons faster than its enemies could react. The The cameras were just one small manifestation of that systematic advantage. They added weight to aircraft that already struggled against Axis fighters in individual encounters. They required maintenance, skilled operators, precious film stock. In the narrow calculus of a single dogfight, they were a liability. But in the broader context of a multi-year campaign involving tens of thousands of sorties and hundreds of thousands of men, they were invaluable. They turned experience into data, data into knowledge, knowledge into doctrine. They created feedback loops that accelerated learning and improved performance. And they did so in a way that no amount of pilot skill or tactical brilliance on the German side could counter. When Major Heinz Knoke climbed out of his Focke-Wulf after yet another desperate defense of the Reich in the winter of 1943, his aircraft riddled with holes from American gunners, his ammunition exhausted, his fuel gauge hovering near empty, he carried with him the knowledge that somewhere, someone had filmed the engagement. An American cameraman, riding in the nose of a fortress or tucked into a fighter's gun bay, had captured his attack run, his evasive maneuvers, perhaps even his face visible for a fraction of a second through the cockpit canopy. That footage would be developed, cataloged, studied. It would inform training programs and tactical briefings. It would, in its small way, contribute to the eventual defeat of the Luftwaffe and the Reich it served. Knoke survived the war, one of the minority who lived to see Germany's surrender. He wrote a memoir, published decades later, in which he reflected on his experiences with the detached clarity of hindsight. He mentioned the cameras only in passing, a curious detail among the many strange aspects of fighting the Americans. But in that brief mention, there is a hint of the bewilderment he must have felt at the time, the sense that the enemy operated according to rules and logic fundamentally different from his own. The Americans fought as if they had already won, as if the outcome were foregone and the only remaining task was to document the process. And in a sense, they had. The cameras proved it. There is a particular reel of footage, preserved in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, that encapsulates the entire phenomenon. It was filmed on February 22, 1944, during a mission against aircraft factories in central Germany. The camera, mounted in the nose of a B-17 from the 303rd Bomb Group, captures the final minutes of a running battle with Luftwaffe fighters. The quality is exceptional by the standards of the era: sharp focus, steady framing, good exposure. You see a Messerschmitt 109 making a head-on pass, growing from a speck to a full-frame menace in seconds. Flashes ripple across its wings as it fires. The camera shakes, impact or turbulence or the bomber's own guns firing, but stays focused. The 109 flashes past so close you can see the individual panels of its fuselage, the oil streaks on its cowling. And then it's gone, and the camera pans to follow it as it breaks away, rolls inverted and dives. Freeze the frame at the moment of closest approach. Enhance the image with modern software. You can just barely make out the pilot through the canopy, a dark shape against the sky, human and vulnerable despite the machine wrapped around him. He is trying to kill the men in the bomber. The men in the bomber are trying to kill him. But someone is filming it all, preserving the encounter for reasons that transcend the immediate tactical situation. That frozen frame, that blurred glimpse of a German pilot at the apex of his attack run, is as close as we can come to understanding the surreal reality of being filmed in combat. He is focused on his gun sight, his target, the coordination of stick and throttle and trigger. He is not thinking about cameras, but the camera is thinking about him, recording him, ensuring that this moment, his skill, his courage, his willingness to fly into point-blank range of a dozen heavy machine guns, will outlive him, will be studied and analyzed and preserved long after the war ends and the participants are gone. The pilot in that particular frame survived the encounter. German records, cross-referenced with mission reports and gun camera footage, identified him as Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a veteran of the North African campaign with 22 kills to his credit. He would survive the war and eventually emigrate to Canada, where he became, improbably, friends with a former B-17 pilot he had once spared over Germany. Their story, rediscovered decades later, became the subject of books and documentaries. But the footage remains, independent of narrative, a pure record of combat stripped of context and meaning. It is simply two men trying to kill each other at 300 miles per hour, 7 miles above the earth, one of them being filmed by a device he likely did not even know was there. What did it mean in the end to be filmed in combat? For the German pilots, for the Japanese airmen who faced similar camera-equipped American aircraft over the Pacific, the answer remained elusive. In the moment, it meant nothing. Survival was the only concern, and the camera was just another piece of equipment on an enemy aircraft, no more threatening than the radio or the oxygen system. But afterward, in the long decades of peace that followed, the meaning deepened. The footage became memory made tangible, history rendered visible. It allowed those who were not there to see, to witness, to understand in ways that written accounts could never achieve. For the Americans who operated those cameras, the work was dangerous and often thankless. Combat cameramen flew the same missions as the rest of the crew, faced the same flak and fighters, but carried cameras instead of guns. Many were killed. Their names appear on the same memorials, their sacrifices recorded in the same casualty lists. But their legacy is unique. They created a visual archive that continues to educate and inform, that brings the air war to life for generations who know it only through history books and fading memories. They documented the courage of their comrades, the ferocity of the enemy, the terrible beauty of combat at high altitude where the sky is black and the stars are visible at noon. And for the historians who study that footage today, parsing it frame by frame, measuring closure rates and deflection angles, identifying aircraft types and squadron markings, the cameras represent a gift beyond price. The air war over Europe was a complex, three-dimensional chess game played at speeds and altitudes that strained human comprehension. The written record, mission reports, personal accounts, official histories, provides one view, but the film provides another, unfiltered and immediate. It shows us what happened, not what someone remembered or reported, but what the camera saw in the moment. It is as close to objective truth as history ever gets. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed and the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a functional fighting force, the cameras continued to roll. They filmed the liberation of concentration camps, the surrender of German armies, the occupation of Berlin. The footage from those final weeks is difficult to watch, suffused with the horror of discovery and the grim satisfaction of victory achieved at terrible cost. But it is necessary footage, evidence of why the war had to be fought, documentation of crimes that could not be denied because they were recorded in excruciating detail. The German pilots who survived, scattered across POW camps and displaced persons facilities, slowly learned the extent to which the war had been documented. They saw the newsreels in the theaters of their captors, watched the footage of bombers streaming over Germany, of fighters falling in flames, of their cities reduced to rubble. Some recognized themselves in the footage, fleeting glimpses of their younger selves preserved in celluloid. Others saw friends, comrades who had not survived, their final moments captured by cameras they had never noticed. It was disorienting and humbling, a reminder that they had been participants in something far larger than individual experience, a conflict that would be studied and analyzed for generations through the lens of those ubiquitous American cameras. Years later, when historians began conducting oral history interviews with surviving veterans, the German pilots often returned to the subject of the cameras. There was a wistfulness in their reflections, a sense of having been caught in the machinery of history, recorded and catalogued like specimens in a museum. They had fought with skill and courage, had believed in their cause or at least in their duty, had endured hardships that would have broken lesser men. But they had fought against a nation that could afford to film them while destroying them, and that disparity, visible in every frame of combat footage, told the story of the war more clearly than any amount of analysis or narrative could achieve. The cameras, in the end, were symbols of abundance, of industrial might, of a confidence so absolute it bordered on arrogance. They said, "We can afford this. We can afford to add weight and complexity for no immediate tactical gain. We can afford to document our victories because our victory is inevitable. We can afford to preserve this history because we believe in the future, in the idea that what we are doing here matters and will continue to matter long after the last shot is fired." For the German aces who faced those cameras in the skies over Europe, the message was clear even if unspoken. They were fighting a nation that had already won, that operated on a scale they could not match, that could outproduce, outman, outsustain them in every category that mattered. The cameras were just one small proof of that overwhelming superiority, a luxury item that became a weapon simply by existing. They demoralized through their very presence, reminding every pilot who noticed them that the enemy could afford to film its own triumph. But they also served a higher purpose, one that transcends strategy and tactics and victory. They preserved memory. They ensured that the sacrifices of that generation, on both sides, victor and vanquished, would not fade into abstraction. The men who flew those missions, who faced death in the cold, thin air above Europe, remain visible in the archives, their youth and determination frozen in silver halide crystals on strips of aging film. The cameras gave them immortality of a sort, not as propaganda or hagiography, but as honest documentation of what war looks like when industrial powers collide. Major Heinz Knoke, returning from that mission in January 1943, could not have known that the camera he glimpsed in the nose of a B-17 would outlive him, would preserve his era, would allow future generations to witness the desperate battle he fought in defense of a regime whose crimes would render all such defense meaningless. He could not have known that the footage would be digitized, uploaded to archives accessible with a few keystrokes, watched by people who would never know war as he knew it. He could only sense, in the instinctive way of men who live close to death, that the cameras meant something, that they represented a difference not just of material but of philosophy, a way of war that was also a way of seeing, of remembering, of bearing witness. The cameras rolled on, indifferent to strategy or ideology, recording everything, judging nothing. They captured the bomber streams and the fighter attacks, the flak bursts and the falling aircraft, the men who fought and the men who died. They accumulated footage at a rate impossible to fully process, creating an archive that would take decades to catalog and study. And in doing so, they transformed the air war from lived experience into documented history, from memory into evidence, from the chaos of combat into the ordered narrative that allows us, 7 decades removed, to understand what happened when the skies of Europe became a battlefield and men fought in machines at speeds and altitudes that still strain comprehension. That is what the German aces could not believe, not just that the Americans filmed their dogfights, but that they did so with such systematic thoroughness, such unwavering commitment to documentation, such absolute confidence that their actions were worth preserving for all time. It was a statement of power wrapped in celluloid, a declaration that this war would be remembered, that the victors would control not just the present but the narrative of history itself. And they were right. The cameras have outlasted the pilots, the battles, the aircraft, the very nation they fought against. They remain silent witnesses to a conflict that changed the world, preserving for anyone willing to look the terrible and transcendent reality of men at war.